Hello, I'm Mrs H. You can find my patterns at www.mrs-h.com. Today's video we're going to be looking at the Quick Zip Trio, which is exclusive to my Patreon channel, patreon.com/Baganeer. This pattern or this project comes in 3 sizes, so you've got a small, a medium and a large. And the pattern also comes with an optional wristlet strap, and I'll show you how to make that and attach it to your project if you want to use that as well. The pouches are fully lined, they've got beautiful little zip ends on them, really nice and neat. There's no pinched zip ends here, and I'll show you how to achieve that. The small one I've added this wristlet strap to, and I've also added a bottle to be used for hand sanitizer, a hygiene key. This is something that you can use just to make sure that you're not using your fingers or your hands to touch things, doors, buttons, pulls, etc. And I've also added a fun tassel keyring to this one. So if you're heading out and about and you want to just take a little pouch or a little purse, then that is great for you. This wristlet can also be used as a keyring if you'd rather use it as a keyring instead. But if you want to add it to your pouch, you can add it to the small, you can add it to the large. I've also added it to the medium size as well. This is a great size. This is actually a really handy size for whatever you want to carry around, pens, pencils. You can put your change in there. A few cards, you can add extra pockets inside, whatever you want to do. They've all got the same neat zip ends and box corners, and also you'll notice in the pattern for this one, they don't have a baggy lining. Don't know if you can see that in there. There's a special way of attaching the seam allowances together inside that just makes sure that that lining sits nice and neat inside your pouch, and it maximizes the space because you haven't got all of this extra baggy fabric to worry about. So this is a great beginner pattern. It's great for stash busting, stocking fillers. I mean, I can think of anybody in your life who wouldn't love a Quick Zip Trio pouch, small, medium or large. This one's the larger size there. You can also adapt the pattern to make it any size you want. You could just follow the method through, or you can just use the wristlet strap as well if you are making keyrings or little extra gifts. So let's get started and we'll see where we go. So let's have a look at what we've got. We've got our 2 exterior panels. I'm using this floral for my exterior. Got 2 lining panels. They're exactly the same size, and they've both got interfacing on the back, or rather all 4 pieces have got interfacing on the back. I've also got my 2 pieces of compressed fleece with my corners cut away and my bottom corners trimmed down to size to match the pattern piece. I've got my 2 Decaville lights, so I'll show you how that fits onto there so you can see how it's been trimmed. So the Decaville light is smaller all round, and then the compressed fleece has got the corners cut out to match the Decaville, and these top corners cut out at an angle. So I've got those. We've got a zip, and I've trimmed this down to match the size that it says on the pattern. So my zip teeth are the length as it says on the pattern. I've got my label, who made it. I've got 2 zip tabs, and they haven't got any interfacing on at all. And then I've also got my wristlet tab, which has got interfacing on, and my ring for my key ring. Now that's optional, so if you don't want to do the wristlet strap, don't need to, but if you do want to, then you will need those 2 as well. So let's get started with fusing. We'll worry about the wristlet separately, so we'll just concentrate on the pouch at the moment, and then we'll work on the wristlet afterwards. So first things first, we are going to get our compressed fleece, and we're going to fuse the Decaville light to the fleece. So line this up so the corner cutouts, the bottom corner cutouts match, and that should mean that you've got half an inch spare all around, and then we can fuse that to each other. I'm just going to use a tea towel just to be sure that I don't fuse anything to my iron. Okay. So once that's fused on, you can leave that just to sit for a minute while we do the other one. I'm fairly certain I have pressed this stabilizer before, but I thought I wasn't going to risk it while I'm filming, just in case. I'll fuse that one on as well. And this just means that the Decavil light, that heavy stabilizer, is going to be matched to the fleece rather than the fabric. So you should hopefully minimise any wrinkles, if there are any wrinkles incoming. Okay, so once you've got these fused on, then we need our exterior panels. And with the Decavil sandwiched between the two, we're going to baste these together. So you've got your exterior fabric on top, your Decavil light, and then your fleece. I'm going to turn this over to make sure that I've got this lined up perfectly, because you can't line up the corners, they've been trimmed away. So make sure that's nicely centered, and I'm going to add a couple of pins just to hold it in place while I baste around. And I'm just going to baste around the outside with a long stitch, just to hold these layers all together while we're sewing. I'll do that on both exterior panels. Let's turn it over. Actually, it's a lot easier to line these up on the back. So rather than struggle, I'll just go straight to that. And when I baste this, I'm going to use the longest stitch on my machine is a number 6. So that's the stitch length I'm going to use. And I'm just going to sew around the top. You can stop and start if you like, or you can just go all the way around the top. It doesn't really matter. You don't need to do around these corner cutouts because there's nothing to hang on to. So I'll change my stitch length up to the longest stitch, and I'm going to baste at 1/8 of an inch, which is 3 mil, because our seam allowance on this pattern is only a 1/4 inch or 6 mil. Right, so that's both our exterior pieces basted onto the stabilizers, and we're ready to sew then. Okay, so we'll pop those to one side with the lining pieces, and we need our zip tabs next. So that's these two. Now I'm going to skip ahead a step, just because I'm doing it on the video and I don't want you to be hanging around waiting for me. I'm going to add a little dab of glue to the end of my zip, hold it together. So you can see this in the pattern as well. I'm just going to add a dab of glue to the open end. And then add a clip to hold those two halves together. Oh, want to actually keep them together. There we go. Okay, so I'll leave that to dry for a minute. I might actually add a little dab of glue just to the other end, just to be sure that that's not going to come off while I'm sewing. Okay, so we'll leave that to dry for a minute while we're working on our zip tabs. And what we need to do is fold your zip tab in half and press. One at a time would be easiest, wouldn't it? So we fold it in half and press, and then open out and fold it in by 1/2 inch and press. Now the easiest way to measure this is to get yourself a ruler and something to make a mark with. Now if you're folding in by 1/2 inch, then draw a line 1 inch in, and then you just fold to that line and you'll have 1/2 inch folded in. So that's what I'm going to do. Let me tidy up a little bit before we do the pressing. I'll get my pressing board back. So I think on each one I'll draw my line. Oh dear, I'm working on a slightly smaller workspace today. I'm really sorry if it seems a bit chaotic. It's just that I haven't worked out where everything is going to go yet. Right, so if I draw that on all 4 ends of my zip ends, and then we know where we are. Right, so first things first, let's fold them in half. And it gives you the dimensions on the pattern, so you can make sure that you're folding it the right way. And a little press, and then I'll fold this one and give it a little press as well. My fabric's quite prone to fraying, so please excuse me if I get a few loose bits. It just matches my lining. Okay, so then we open out, fold each short end in by 1/2 inch, so I folded it into my line, and then we'll do the other side as well. Fold and press, and then fold it again along the original line and give it one last final press just to make sure it's nice and neat. Okay, and then this one I can open up and fold each short end in by 1/2 inch. This is one of those steps where a bit of steam really makes a huge difference to the finished project. Okay, and then fold it again along the original line, give it a little press. Okay, so I've got my 2 zip ends all nicely folded in, and I can retrieve my zip, which has been sitting drying, and I'm going to open these out, and I need a bit of tape, I think would be a good idea. And now my tape has been sitting for a little while, so it's a little bit dry on the end. Snip a bit off, and I'll add a little bit inside on that bit, and I can peel the backing off and then slot my zip in. Now this should match perfectly widthwise, and I'm going to line up the end of my zip with the end of that folded over bit. Okay, let me just double check that I haven't missed any steps before we go in. Yep. Okay, so the end of the zip tape is matching the edge of that folded bit, and then we'll add a bit more double-sided tape to the other side and fold it along that original crease line and press it into place there. Okay, now we're going to do exactly the same for this other end, and that's why we've glued it, just to keep those ends, those bits together when we attach them into this zip end. So open it out again, add a little bit of tape, and then add the end of the zip with the end of the teeth matching the edge of that folded over bit. Give it a nice press down, and then a bit more tape on the other side, and we can refold along that original line and press into place. Okay, so I wouldn't recommend doing this and walking away. I'd recommend doing it and then sewing it straight away, so that you know that it's, you know, the tape is not going anywhere, it's not going to come unattached or unbasted. I'm going to change my stitch length back down to a regular stitch length. Now I'm going to sew across each end here. I'm going to sew along the top of the zip tab, and that's going to hold that in place. So make sure that you give yourself a nice regular seam allowance that you can follow really neatly, and we're just going to sew from one side to the other. You don't need to back stitch, but you can if you want. I personally don't, because I think it gives you a neater finish in the end product, because if you do a bit and then back stitch and then keep going, you can sometimes get a bit of a wobble. So I'm going to pop that under the sewing machine, and I'm just going to use a really scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's kind of a 2mm seam allowance there. And you don't want to go too small on the seam allowance, because you want it to be on your fabric, but you don't want to be too far, because you want it to catch the end folds of that fabric. Okay, so once you've sewn those and you're happy with those, yep, they look neat, that's great. Okay, we can pop that to one side for the minute. We'll add that to our exterior panels. You need your wristlet tab if you are sewing the wristlet. If not, then you can just skip ahead to the next step, or just fast forward me for a minute. Right, so we are going to fold each end into the center. So let me see if we can do this in a slightly neater way than just guesstimating. Right, so that'd be a half, that'd be 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line down the center, 5/8 of an inch from the center. That's 1.6 centimeters. And then I'm going to fold each long edge into the center. So I'll need my pressing mat back. And I'm going to fold and give it a little press just to hold it in place. I'm going to fold both sides in to the center. This is a nice little fiddly task to do. You can make these bigger if you're finding that it's too small and fiddly to do. You can make these bigger if you want to. Just do whatever's most comfortable for you. Okay, so we've got both long edges folded in to the center, and now we are going to top stitch on the right side, so not the folded side, that's the folded side. So we're going to turn it over and top stitch along each long edge using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, or 3mm. Now this is great if you're making these as gifts. You can whiz these through the machine all in one go, and you haven't got to worry about stopping and starting. As I'm only making one, figured I'd better just stop and start though. Right, so that's got those ends nice and neat. Now we're going to fold it through our key ring part, or our ring part. Get my loose threads out because they'll come back to haunt me, I know. And then I'm just going to baste along the end just to keep those bits together. Just to know that when I'm sewing with this, it's not going anywhere. Right, to add the wristlet strap then, what you need is your little tab with your ring attached and your main exterior panel. And we are gonna, for it to sit really nicely when you're carrying it on your wrists, I think you need to place this about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from the top of your pouch. And so I'm gonna measure that, and that's about 1 inch, and line up the raw edges on the side. And I'm just gonna add a little, actually I'll use a clip just to hold that in place, and I'm gonna baste that into place to make sure that that doesn't go anywhere while we're constructing our pouch. Okay, now you can ignore the wristlet strap until later on in the construction, after you've finished and it's time to make the wristlet strap. Right, so we've got both of our main panels ready and we've got our zip ready. So what we need is 1 exterior main panel and 1 lining main panel. And we are going to add a line of basting tape along the top there. Now what I'd like to do is mark the center of everything before we do any kind of construction. And I've got some chalk here, so that will be fine. Mark the center there. And then we know that everything's nice and lined up. I'll mark the center on my exterior with a pin because that's a little bit harder to see. And the center on my lining panel as well. Okay, just so that we know everything is all nice and neat and lined up. It's not going to go skew-iff or anything. Okay, so we're just going to add basting tape for the length of the zip. So place your zip above your panel and then you can see how far you need to go with your tape from end to end of that zip. And we're going to run it along the very, very top of our panel on the right side of our exterior. And then we're going to place our zip right sides down. So right sides matching the centers. Now you can kind of decide yourself which way round you want the zip. I like to have my open end of my zip nearest my wristlet strap if I'm doing a wristlet strap, because then I know that when I'm carrying this pouch, the zip is facing up and you haven't got to worry about anything falling out just in case your zip fails. Okay, so I've added my tape and then I've added my zip right sides down. I'm going to add another line of tape just along the line of the zip. We're going to be sewing all the way, but we don't want this tape in our seam allowance for later. Okay, so then we'll add our lining right sides down. So that's matching centers again and the ends. So we've got lining and exterior right sides together, and the zip, the wrong side of the zip matching the lining and the right side of the zip matching the exterior. Now you can add a clip at the start and the end if you want, because you haven't got any tape holding these ends together in place. And then we're going to sew along the length of this zip. Now I am actually going to change to my zip foot to sew this, which is very unusual for me because usually I like to sew everything with my walking foot. But on this occasion, it is a much better idea to swap to your zip foot if you've got one, or an adjustable zip / piping foot. I'm going to change my foot over now quickly. And add this zip foot on. Okay. Now we're going to sew the entire length of this zip, and we are going to sew it at, let me tell you, double check before I tell you. Oh, hang on, I've lost the page. Oh dear, lost the page somewhere. Good job I designed it and I can remember everything, isn't it? We're going to sew it at a 1/4 inch, I believe. Well, that's what I'm going to sew it at anyway. I'm going to put my seam guide on here. Okay. Right, so we'll just turn that back, check that I've done nice and neat seam allowance there. Yep, that looks fine. Now, you can either top stitch now between that zip end and that zip end, or you can sew the other side of the zip and then top stitch them together, which is what I'm going to do, because then I know that I can swap over to my walking foot and get a nice neat finish with that. So all we're going to do is get our exterior main panel. Again, let's mark the centres so that we know we are all lined up. Top tip there, if you were watching closely, remove the pin before you start sewing because it will get caught under your foot. And let's line up the zip just so I know where to put my tape along the top there, just between the two zip ends. Okay, and then we're going to add the zip right sides down. We're going to ignore the fact that we've got a half of the pouch already attached. Just going to pretend it's just the zip on its own, and just add that zip onto the tape. Then we need another piece of tape. I'm going to turn this round just so I can see what I'm doing either side of the bulk, and I'm going to add that along the length of the tape, zip tape again. Okay, and then add my lining panel. Oh, need to find the centre of this. Let's find the centre there. I've had a thought just briefly before I do. I'm going to add my little label. Just going to baste it into the seam allowance just before I forget. I'm just going to put that in. So if you've got a label, don't forget to put yours in. Okay. So then I'll match the centres again and go all the way along. Now we're going to stitch, same as we did before, the total length, the full length from end to end of this top using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure my ends are nice and neat together. Okay, right, so we can pull those back, make sure that's nice and neat. Yep, we should have a nice little gap at either end. Don't panic, that is how it's supposed to be. I'm going to change over my presser foot again, back to my walking foot, so I can do a nice neat top stitch on this. I just don't trust myself with the walking foot to get a nice neat top stitch. I find that I go a bit wobbly, which is why I like to use my walking foot. I don't really need a walking foot on this machine for sewing bags, but I like it because I find it keeps everything in place because it's nice and wide and helps me to sew a bit straighter by keeping everything in place, and I can follow the guides, so that's why I like to use it. I just swap that over and screw it in. There we go. Okay, right, so now before we top stitch, I'm going to increase my stitch length slightly for top stitching. Before we top stitch, just need to give this a little press. So all we do is just fold the layers back on either side of the zip and give that a nice little press. Make sure that everything is nice and neat and in place before we top stitch. And give it a little press from the other side as well. Make sure that these bits of fabric that we've sewn in, these panels, are not going to get caught in the zip. There's nothing more frustrating, is there, than having fabric caught in the zip when you're unzipping it. Pressing this back, and I'm just actually on these ends just making sure that that's nice and pulled back out of the way. And when we top stitch, we're not going to top stitch over those ends, we're only going to top stitch between zip end to zip end, and that means that when we come to do the construction of the pouch, you're able to open up those seams really nice and neat. Okay, right, that looks pretty neat to me. Okay, well, I've just got a stray thread there. Okay, right, so what we are going to do, oh dear, what we're going to do is top stitch just between zip end to zip end. Okay, so we're only going to go between the two zip ends. We're going to go from here to here, and I don't really want to show any kind of back stitching on this. I want it to look really nice and neat, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my thread tails out so they're nice and long before I start. To do this, I've got to pull my bobbin out because I use the automatic thread cutter on my bobbin. But I want a nice long bobbin thread, and I'm going to want a nice long top thread tail as well. Okay, and we're going to leave these tails long and pull them through to the back and tie them off. So with your thread tails nice and long, pop this under the machine, and we're going to start sewing right at the end of that zip tab. Start with your needle down and your thread tails long. If I haven't said thread tails long, keep your thread tails long. And we're going to just sew to the other end. I'm using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, or 3mm. Okay, so if you've got a thread cutter, don't use it. Instead, pull your panels out and leave your thread tails nice and long. Okay, and then we're going to turn it around and do the same on the other side. Okay, so we've got nice long threads on all 4 sections, so where we start and where we stop. Turn your panel over to the wrong side and you've got your bobbin thread here. If you pull on that, you'll see a little loop appear, and that is the top thread. So if you pull on that loop, you can pop a pin in it if you would like, and then you can tie these 2 together. I do a couple of knots, and I'll do all 4 like this, and then I'll trim them and add a dab of fray check onto them as well. Right, so I've tied those. Now you can cut them down to the knot. Okay, and then I'll add a dab of fray check just to be sure that they are not coming undone. Gone to all this trouble to get a nice neat finish. Don't really want them coming undone, do you? Okay. Right, next thing that we're going to do is finish the construction of this. Okay, so pull your panels together, right sides together, so you've got lining to lining and exterior to exterior, and match these up. Let me just snip some of these threads. I've got a lot of stray threads in this one. Okay, now the most important part here is, there's 2 most important parts. Firstly, to open these seam allowances where the exterior meets the lining, and we're going to match those together. Okay, so open those seam allowances up and match those together. Make sure that they match really nice and neat, and add a pin in through all of those layers. That is what's going to give you the nice neat ends on your zip pouch. Okay, so open the seam allowance on this side and again on this side. Okay, and add a pin. The second other most important thing is to remember to leave a turning gap in the bottom of your lining. So if you're using pins, now on this side I'm doing the medium on this one, and it's not too bad because you can get a nice long turning gap. If you're making the small, try and leave that turning gap as big as you can because it is a little bit tight turning it out. So I'm doing double pins here to remind myself to leave a turning gap. I'm actually going to baste across my turning gap and then remove the stitches afterwards, but by adding the double pins it reminds me that that's what I'm doing. Okay, and then just flatten all of these layers out so they're nice and neat and all the edges match as best they can. If your cutting out is not 100% accurate, don't panic, just smooth it out so that they match as best they can. As long as you're, oh, hang on a second. Whew, my zip is open. If you haven't checked, just double check that your zip is open. Okay, but as long as you're not twisting your layers, then you should be okay. Just to smooth them out and pin them together. And we are going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, our regular stitch length. If you've added the wristlet tab, make sure that's tucked in nice and neat out of your seam allowance there. Add a clip to hold that in place. Now we are going to sew along this side from corner cutout to corner cutout, along the bottom of the exterior from corner cutout to corner cutout, up this second side from corner cutout to corner cutout, and then we're going to sew these two end bits, back stitch at the start, back stitch at the end, back stitch at these two starts of our turning gap, and then I'm going to baste across there. So I'm going to sew using my regular stitch length for the rest of it, and then a really long stitch length for this middle turning gap bit. I'm going to steam press those stitches, then I'm going to take them out, and then when we come to fold it through later and fold our seam allowances down on our turning gap, we've got a nice neat line of holes to follow. Okay, so make sure to back stitch at the start and end of all of these seams, and we are using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and our regular stitch length. Okay, now you can, if you want, taper in slightly on these sides just to reduce bulk when you're making the larger size. You shouldn't be too bad on the medium or the small. We'll take all these pins out and then we can steam press our basting stitches. I'm just going to add a shot of steam to these stitches, and that just helps leave stitch holes behind when we take them out. So I will actually, let's box our corners first if we can, and then take the basting stitches out. Right, I haven't got any pins left, just double checking I'm not going to get myself with the pins. Right, so just pinch your panels to bring your bottom seam up to match your top seam, and you can either have your seam allowances open or you can nest them together, whichever you prefer. And we'll do the same on the other corners as well. And this is how we're going to box the bottom of our pouch. So we just bring the side seam to match the bottom seam, and the same on the exterior. This one's slightly harder because it's got the stabilizer attached, so you just need to pop your finger in through that boxed corner and smooth all the layers out before you sew. Just open the panel out and smooth it out before you clip these together, ready to sew. Pretty good to me. Okay, and then all we're going to do is sew across these boxed corners using our regular seam allowance. Back stitch again at the start and the end using our regular stitch length. Okay, right, now is definitely the time to take these stitches out if you haven't already. So with your handy unpicker, take these basted stitches out of the bottom of the lining. Right, once you've taken out those basting stitches, what we're going to do now is bring each box corner to match its counterpart. So on the exterior, bring the lining box corner to meet, okay? And then we're going to clip that. And then on the other side, now this will be a bit of a squash, so just manipulate your pouch so that you can do this. Bring the other side to match. Okay, we're going to sew these seam allowances together within the seam allowance. Okay, and this is just going to hold your lining nice and neat in place inside so you don't get a baggy lining. So stay sewing within the seam allowances and sew these box corners together. Okay, then we're going to turn this through the turning gap and turn those box corners out first as best you can. You won't be able to do that fully until you've got the lining turned through. But with one hand inside the pouch still, just work your way round to these ends and make sure that that seam allowance, or both of those seam allowances, are still open on the end, okay? And that's how you're going to get a nice neat zip end there. And then the same on this side, make sure that those seam allowances, there's a bit of a wriggle to get past the box corners inside there, but it is worth doing just to make sure those seam allowances are nice and open. Okay, so then push your box corners out, and remember you've got them joined together, so you've got to push the lining box corners out into the exterior box corners. Okay, so smooth everything out. Once you're happy that that's all looking good, then we can close our turning gap. So it seems slightly counterintuitive to turn it out and then turn it back through again, but it's worth it just to double check that it's nice and neat before you close this turning gap. So all we're going to do is fold along this original basting line, and then we're going to close this. You can close it with either a very neat hand ladder stitch, or if you're not so neat at hand sewing like me, you can use a close machine stitch. So I'm going to use a close machine stitch. I'm just folding all along that original seam line, just to make sure it's nice and neat. And then just adding a pin into here because that's a little bit tight for me to get to. And then I'll just sew that closed. Just manipulate the fabric of the pouch out of the way however you need to be able to get that nice and flat under the foot. Okay, so just double check that's all fine, there's no holes or gaps or anything, no pins left in, and then push this back out, making sure that those corners are nice and neat and properly turned out. Oh, I've got a rather long stray thread there, don't know how I missed that one. Just snip that off. And you can give your pouch a final press then. If you what I tend to do is I tend to get a tea towel and roll it up and pop it in, and then you can press on the pouch itself. That's what I do. So I'll roll it up so it's quite tight, pop it in, and then I'll press this end and then pop the other end in. In fact, I might be able to get it in all together, so there we go. Then you can press. If you've got a tailor's ham, a tailor's roll, then obviously that's where that would come into perfect use. But if you haven't, then just roll up a tea towel and pop it in, and then we'll just give it a little final press just to make it nice and neat. And I do like to press on the bottom because then it makes your box bottom sit nice and neat, doesn't it? And you can sort of give it a bit of a manipulation with your fingers just to make a nice neat box bottom. There we go. So if you steam it and while it's still warm, you sort of plop it down, it does give it a nice neat standy uppy kind of shape, which is nice. Right, so that is your pouch completed. Don't forget to take your tea towel out before you use it or gift it to somebody else, unless you're going to use it as a tea towel holder, in which case, there we go, perfect use. So that's your pouch finished. If you'd like to make the wristlet strap to go with it, or add a wristlet strap to any other bag, then keep watching and we'll go through that next. Right, to make the wristlet then, so we've added our wristlet tab into our project. I've added mine to my quick zip trio. So you've got the ring already attached to your project. What you need is your exterior and your lining. In fact, I don't know if I might swap those around. So I have the gold on the exterior and the floral on the exterior. I don't know, might be quite fun. But then you also need your stabilizer. So we've got a strip of Decaville Light and a strip of compressed fleece, and I've fused those two together, so they are attached. You'll also need your hardware, your metal hardware for the end of your wristlet, some pliers, or if you've got specific pliers for these this hardware, then use one of those instead. I've got a piece of foam just to protect my hardware when I come to use my pliers, and a bit of glue. I'm using Fabri-Tac glue, and also a marker. I'm just using a chalk marker. Right, so all we are going to do is draw a line down the centre of each of these pieces of fabric. So these are twice the width of my hardware. So my hardware is 1 inch wide. So I've cut my fabric strips 2 inches wide, and I've cut them, let me tell you what length I've made them. I've made them 14 inches, which I think is a nice comfortable length for a wristlet strap like this. Okay, so it's short enough that it stays on your wrist, but it's not too short that you can't get it off then if you have got your hands full and you're juggling shopping and bags and keys and things. So all we're going to do is draw a line down the centre, so that's 1 inch from each edge because my fabric is 2 inches wide. And then we're going to fold each long edge into the centre and press it into place. So far, so simple, right? Okay. So I'll put my hardware and my stabiliser and everything to one side for the minute. Get my pressing board out. So all I'm going to do is fold each long edge into the centre and press it into place as though you were making a shoulder strap or something for a bag. Exactly the same as that. Just fold and press. And I'm using steam so I get a nice, neat, crisp finish on this as well. There's one side. I'm going to do the second side then. So both edges are going into the centre. I find when I'm doing things like this with my fingers really close to the steam, if you blow gently, it blows the steam away from your fingers, and you minimise your risk of scalding yourself then. Okay, so once that's pressed, I turn it upside down and just let gravity sort of keep those edges under. And then I do the same on my second piece. Just fold all along that whole way with the edge under. And the same on the other edge. Okay. Right, so once we are happy that they are pressed, you can pop our pressing mat aside. Right. Now we are going to sandwich the stabiliser in between these two layers. Okay, so I've got my folded side up, my nice side down, and then pop the stabilizer on top. Hang on, I've forgotten to trim my stabilizer down, so you should say, so your stabilizer should be slightly smaller than your fabric. So I'm going to cut mine down by 1/8 of an inch. Of course, I don't have my rotary cutter with me because that would make it too easy, wouldn't it? So I'm just going to mark it and then trim it with scissors. And this just stops it peeking out when you're sewing. Just cut your stabilizer slightly smaller than the fabric, that's all. And I've got my Decaville and my compressed fleece fused together. Okay, so now I can lay this down on top of my fabric and just make sure it's nice and centered. So my stabilizer is, let me double check, my stabilizer is 1 inch shorter, so I should have 1/2 inch gap on each end. Just make sure that's nice and centered. You can use some double-sided tape on this if you want to, just to hold it in place. And then we're going to add the second piece of fabric right side up on top. Okay, so we've got nice side either end, and then our folded sides facing in towards the stabilizer. Okay, I'm just going to clip that to keep them together. I'm starting to wonder whether I should have maybe used some double-sided tape on this one. Okay, so I'm just going to keep those layers all nice and together. We're going to top stitch along each longer edge to keep these in place nice and neat. Okay, so I'm going to top stitch with 1/8 of an inch seam, or 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. That's 3 mil if you're using metric. I'm going to use my top stitching stitch length, which is slightly longer for me, and I'm going to go from end to end. I am actually going to back stitch because I don't want to risk anything coming undone. Okay, and then I'm going to sew down the other side exactly the same way. Okay, so I've got all of my layers attached together, nice and neat. What we're going to do now is fold this right sides together. So I'm going to use my floral on the outside, I think. So we're going to fold it right sides together, floral side in, if you're also using floral for your outside, which would be a nice coincidence. And then we're going to sew these using a 1/4 inch or 6 mil seam allowance. So we're going to sew these ends together, and you can just use your regular construction length, stitch length, if you want for this one. Now I've gone over it a few times and I've ended my stitching in the middle, and that means that any loose threads are not going to be showing on the end of my wristlet hardware. Okay, so just trim all these extra bits and pieces away. Okay, and then we just trim the seam allowance of this down to a 1/4 inch, sorry, 1/8 of an inch or 3 mil. So we're sewing at a 1/4 inch, 6 mil, and we're trimming it down to 1/8 of an inch, 3 mil. Okay, and then all we do is we just turn it right sides out, back on itself like this. So push those edges out really nice and neat into that little seam at the end there. Okay, I would give that a little press as well, just to be sure that it's nice and neat, because you're going to be popping that into the hardware, so you want it to be nice and neat. And then we're going to stitch through this 1/8 of an inch away from the end. If you can, if your machine is not strong enough, you can just add this into the hardware as it is. But if your machine is strong enough, then I would recommend that you do. It just holds it nice and neat together. Okay. Trim all these extras, make sure there's no loose ends or threads or anything. If you can see a little bit of loose threads on the side, you can add a bit of fray check if you want, although you'll find that they'll soon come away with use, because you've secured your seams and you've backstitched, etc. Okay, all that you need to do now is add it into the hardware. So what I like to do is just double check the fit of it. Check that's nice and neat. That looks great, actually. I'm quite pleased with that. Quite pleased I did do the floral on the outside now. And then add a dab of glue right into that channel. So you can either add it into the hardware, or you can add it on the end of your fabric that's going into that hardware. Either way, you need to get a good little bit of glue right in the center there. Okay, so I've added mine all along the bottom, and then just make sure that that is slotted all the way in, and that the end of the wristlet is meeting the end of the hardware. Now you can leave that to dry for a moment if you want to, or you can go on to set it straight away. If you've got specific hardware pliers, then use those now. I haven't, so I'm just using the ones out of my toolkit, and I'm adding some foam, and I'm just doubling it over. Okay, and I'm just going to very, very, very gently, without it popping out, very, very, very gently just squash this down and set it into place. And I'm just going along the length. So I've done one end, and then I've done the other end, and then I've done the middle. And if you think actually that's not quite fully set, you can go ahead and do it again. I just find little and often, lots of gentle squashes is much, much better and more effective than one big squash, because otherwise you get a dented piece of hardware. Right, so that is pretty much as secured as it can be from a squashing point of view. And I've added my glue in there, so I am fairly confident that that is not coming out anywhere. I would recommend leaving that to dry, leaving the glue to dry, maybe for an hour or two before you use it. It should be secure just from the squashing, but just in case it's not, I would recommend leaving it for a little bit. And then all that you need to do is attach the wristlet onto the ring, and there you are. You've got a fun key fob wristlet attached to your project, if that's how you want to use it, or you can use it to attach to your keys. I've got my keys here. You attach your keys onto the wristlet end as a key fob. Make sure that you hang on to them, or you can have them all together as a, you know, if you're popping out, quick trip out, you can add your keys, your wristlet, your pouch, carry it all together really nice and neat and handy. I hope you've enjoyed that little tutorial, and I look forward to seeing what you make. I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. I'm really pleased with the pouch that I made and my wristlet strap, and I'm going to put that into use straight away. Thank you for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you make.